A very good evening to you and welcome to the House of Literature here in Bergen. My name is Merete Hobbelstad. I'm an author, critic, journalist with Norwegian newspaper Dagbladet. I'm not by any means the main person here tonight because that is our guest of honor, author Douglas Stuart, the author who's riveted the world with the novel Shuggie Bain. I'm here in rainy Bergen. He is the luckier of us, I think, because he is in sunny New York, and still he has taken this time to sit on his sofa and to be part of this conversation. Good evening. How are you?
Hi, Inger. Thank you for having me in Norway tonight. I'm well, thank you.
Thank you for being here. You know, I was thinking, reading Shuggie Bain, when the thought first hit you that this, in fact, could be a novel, what exactly was that first glint of an idea? What was sort of the original spark that you thought that this is actually something that I should write about?
You know, I think it was actually less of a thought and more of a feeling or a compulsion to begin writing. And I sat down just having visualized a lot of the different scenes and chapters within the book and thought I really wanted to capture it and to really show the story of this family in 1980s Glasgow. And actually, when I first began to write the book, Inger, I wouldn't allow myself to imagine it would be a finished book because that seemed like too much of a thing to wish for or too intimidating. And so I really just sat down and I wrote the chapters as they came to me.
You're now a Booker Prize winner, which is quite extraordinary, this being your first novel. And of course, you've written short stories before, but what was most challenging to you about writing a novel? You worked on this novel for so many years. How did you change as a writer during that time?
Well, I don't actually come from a traditional literary background. I don't have an MFA. I don't have a circle of writer friends. And so to write Shuggie over 10 years, it was really about learning my craft for myself and challenging myself with creating the novel. But the book was actually, I think the reason why it took 10 years is because I knew I had to mature both as a writer and as a human being while I was writing it. Because the book for me was a lesson in empathy. I write a lot about sadness and trauma and things that happen to vulnerable people within the book. And from my own personal experience, I knew what those felt like, what it felt like to feel like that. But I didn't necessarily know what made other people act in that way or the societal causes for it. And so it really took me 10 years to explore the root motivation of some of the things that were happening to the characters in the book.
Shuggie Bain is a story about many things, but maybe first and foremost, I think it is the novel of the bond between a boy and his mother. And Shuggie grows up in Glasgow in poverty during the Thatcher years. His mother is an alcoholic, albeit a rather glamorous one. And Shuggie himself is a sensitive boy who does not quite fit into the masculine ideals that surround him. But I thought we might talk a little bit first about this mother figure who's such a dominating figure in the novel. Her name is Agnes, and perhaps you'd like to read an excerpt for us about Agnes.
Absolutely. This is actually where we meet Agnes in the novel. It's at the very beginning of the book. But Agnes is a very beautiful, generous, determined woman. But she is living in poverty in Glasgow and living in one of the high-rise flats, actually, at the heart of the city. And here we meet Agnes for the first time, where she is looking around at her life and chafing at the smallness of it. Agnes Bain pushed her toes into the carpet and leaned out as far as she could into the night air. The damp wind kissed her flushed neck and pushed down inside her dress. It felt like a stranger's hand, a sign of living, a reminder of life. With a flick, she watched her cigarette dout fall, the glowing embers dancing 16 floors down onto the dark forecourt. She wanted to show the city this claret velvet dress. She wanted to feel a little envy from strangers, to dance with men who held her proud and close. Mostly, she wanted to take a good drink, to live a little. With a stretch of her calves, she leaned her hip bone on the window frame and let go of the ballast of her toes. Her body tipped down towards the amber city lights and her cheeks flushed with blood. She reached her arms out to the lights, and for a brief moment she was flying. No one noticed the flying woman. She thought about tilting further then, dared herself to do it. How easy it would be to kid herself that she was flying until it became only falling, and she broke herself on the concrete below. The high-rise flat she still shared with her mother and father pressed in against her. Everything And the room behind her felt so small, so low-ceilinged and stifling. Payday to mass day, a life bought on tick, with nothing that ever felt owned outright. To be 39 and have her husband and her 3 children all crammed together in her mammy's flat gave her a feeling of failure. Him, her man, who when he shared her bed now seemed to lie on the very edge, made her feel angry with the littered promises of better things. Agnes wanted to put her foot through it all, or to scrape it back like it was spoilt wallpaper, to get her nail under it and to rip it all away. Thank you.
Thank you. That was so beautiful. And I was thinking, Agnes, of course, is a woman. She has a problem with addiction, with alcohol, but she's also a woman of strong longings and a fascination with the world of glamour. And another woman who's very much present, I think, in the story of Agnes and Shuggie is the movie star Elizabeth Taylor, because Agnes is modelling herself on Elizabeth Taylor. And I also know that, well, there are some autobiographical aspects of this novel, and you said that your mother too had strong feelings about Elizabeth Taylor as well. What is it about Elizabeth Taylor and about her appeal and fascination for these women who are living quite hard lives, one should say?
Yeah, I've been wrestling with that question for a long time. Agnes, the character, models herself on Elizabeth Taylor, who's an incredibly glamorous woman, but is also quite a difficult, when you think of her as an actress, she's a difficult actress. She doesn't ever play meek characters. She's always domineering. She's always difficult. She takes charge of the men in her life. She likes to live and to love, and she drinks heavily in her movies and in her personal life. But all in all, Elizabeth Taylor is this very glamorous woman who refuses to be sort of talked down to. And I think, in a way, my own mother, who suffered with addiction, was that same sort of woman, but she was treated very differently for having those aspirations. You know, she was seen for having 2 marriages behind her as somehow having failed as a woman. She was seen for enjoying a bit of fun and a bit of glamour and some alcohol as being not how mothers should conduct themselves. So I think my mother always looked at Elizabeth Taylor as some kind of icon, but also how is she celebrated for it and how am I vilified for it? But as a kid, Inger, you know, my mother suffered with addiction. My own mother suffered with addiction from my earliest memories till she passed away when I was about 16. And one of the things that I learned to do as a kid to keep my mother safe, to keep her attention on me, is I would pretend to write her memoirs. And so I would sit at her feet when I'm like 6 or 7 years old, and she would just tell me stories from her life. But because there was alcohol involved, we never tended to get too far. But she always began with the dedication, and that was always to Elizabeth Taylor. And she would say, to Elizabeth Taylor, who knows nothing about love. And I thought that was always remarkable, that this, you know, very ordinary housewife living in Glasgow thought she would write her memoir and dedicate it to the biggest Hollywood star.
Growing up like that, as Shuggie does, and in a way like you did, with a mother who has, well, a drinking problem, it's a huge question. But what about that experience was it that you wanted to convey? What about the feelings and anguish, I believe, about living with a mother who has that kind of problems? Was it that you wanted to come across to your readers?
I think I just wanted to share the experience, but also share its complexity. I think growing up with that, I saw very quickly how women were shunned within a community and how they were reduced to just the label that they were. They were alcoholics and they were discarded in that way. And for me, my mother was so much more, and Agnes Bain, the character, is so much more than that. Incredibly complex people who are determined and generous and gregarious, but also hurt and sometimes damaging to themselves and the people around them. And so in a way, writing Shuggie Bain was a way to memorialize my own mother, who's been dead now for 30 years, but also to just show that people are very sort of complex in that way. You know, it was a time of patriarchy, and it was a time when mothers didn't conform to the church and to the standards of the community they were in, they were very quickly left without a voice. And I wanted to celebrate those women. You know, I wanted to celebrate my mother first and foremost.
That's interesting because also I mentioned Elizabeth Taylor, but there's also another woman who's juxtaposed with Agnes throughout the novel, and that is Saint Agnes. So there is a sort of heavy religious metaphor hanging over your story. And this, in fact, was a saint who was sentenced to be burned to death in early Christianity, I think. So why was this a fruitful comparison to you, the unhappy Agnes, the mother in the novel, and the saint of the same name?
Yeah, I actually didn't know what Agnes was going to be called in the novel for many of the first drafts, and she had many different names. But I was really making a comment. The journey that Agnes goes through in the book between her two husbands and then a man she falls in love with at the end is she is living a life that is very influenced by men or shaped by the patriarchy that she lives in, as is her son, Shuggie. And when I went to Rome, I think I was halfway through the drafts of the book, I came across the martyrdom of St. Agnes of Rome. And here was a martyr of a woman who, because she refused marriage and refused to go with the men that wanted her, she was actually dragged through the streets. She was first of all denounced as a Catholic. And then when they decided they were going to abuse her, God intervenes and covers her body with hair. But the tragedy is although that saves her body in that sense, the men won't be determined or deterred from really destroying this poor girl at the heart of it. And so instead they set fire to her. And I think I was thinking a lot about the determination of men sometimes, because the character of Shug within the book really does try to destroy his wife. And I was thinking about Agnes and her addiction as a metaphor for flames and being surrounded by it. And also St. Agnes steps out of the flames before she is truly destroyed. And that, for me, was really fitting for what addiction can feel like.
Because you are, in a way, describing a child who has to become a parent and a caretaker to the person who is supposed to take care of him. So I thought I'd ask you, what is it like to be in such a situation, and what is it like to look back on it? What do you think of that situation now that you were placed in at that time that would not have occurred to you when you were a child?
You know, children are remarkable, and I'm not referring necessarily to myself, because actually it was a time in British history when a lot of families were struggling because unemployment, especially in the East End of Glasgow, went to 26%. And so there was a lot of hardship. But children are remarkable because they do tend to cope with the thing that's in front of them, and they find really resourceful ways to keep trying to make things better. And for me as a kid, there was a real comfort in my own ignorance. I didn't know any better. It's only as an adult where you get to come out and you get to see how other people live and how they were brought up that you have some context. But for me, I only knew my mother. I only loved my mother, and I only knew what was happening at home. And so it very quickly inverted our relationship where I became the caregiver, and, you know, sometimes it really covered everything in the house. But at the same time, it was all I knew. And not only was it happening inside my home, I had friends who were going through a very similar thing, and I tried to illustrate that in the book. And so you just really get on with it, I think, Inger, is what you say.
Because it's interesting, because there are three siblings in this novel. There's Shuggie, and then there's his brother and his sister. And they react very differently to this. They head out the door at different times. So they all seem to sort of struggle with this question, how long do I stay and hold on to this person, and when do I let go? And they decide to let go at different times. But what did you want to explore with these three siblings and the way they have different relationships to the mother and to her situation?
Yeah, it's a little bit Dickensian in a way. It's a little bit of a Christmas Carol where they're showing Shuggie sort of what the future could hold and what could be there. But one of the central questions of the book is, how far do you go to save the person you love the most before you have to save yourself? And each of Agnes's children come up against that question, and they increase the burden for Shuggie, who is the youngest child, where they relinquish care of their mother at a certain point, and then Shuggie is really left in isolation with them. But for me, actually, the Leek is my favorite character in the book. Leek is the middle son and is Shuggie's older brother. But Leek makes many sacrifices as a young man and doesn't tell anyone about them. He keeps furloughing his own dreams, almost like a Jude Folly from Jude the Obscure, where he keeps trying to ascend to education and to betterment, and yet his mother and his brother keep getting in his way and stop him doing that. And so really I wanted to just show, you know, the balance there is between children and parents of addiction, where you can do everything you can to save someone, but at the end of the day, the person has to save themselves.
If I could ask you a personal question, you mentioned you lost your own mother when you were only a teenager. In what way has that shaped you? Because obviously she was a huge influence on your life, and then she vanishes so soon, so much sooner than what other people's parents do. So what has been the effect on your life from that, if you care to share something about that?
Oh, absolutely immense. I was also the son of a single mother, so I didn't know my father ever. And so the loss of my mother at 16 shaped everything about me. First of all, you're left with a little bit of guilt that there's something more you could have done to save a person from addiction, or, so you spend a lot of time sort of reflecting on what else could I have done, or how could I have changed myself? And then really writing Shuggie Bain is driven by that feeling of loss, or that feeling of grief. My mother's been dead now for 30 years, but I sat down to write the book 20 years after she died in order, in a way, to conjure her up. And not just the difficult things about what she was going through or the situation, but the joys of her, how she carried herself with pride, how she was funny, how she was irreverent at times, how she was incredibly strong, and how she had these really humble dreams. And, it's a way to memorialize all of these things and to create a character. But I think literature is a fantastic way to do that, to introduce people to readers that they would never have got to meet.
So about that, you were saying in the beginning of the conversation that your mother and Agnes, they're both much more than their addictions. And something I found interesting is that how Shuggie and his mother, they live in poverty, but nevertheless they always manage to find some glamour in their everyday lives. Agnes often manages to stay well put together in spite of her addiction, and Shuggie is acutely aware of things that are beautiful around him. So I'm thinking, when you live in circumstances like that, which are pretty hard, what does beauty mean to you? Finding what is beautiful, what does that mean in a world that does not offer all that much that is beautiful?
Yeah, I always think that's an interesting thing to talk about, because I think sometimes people think that when you live in poverty, your life is necessarily grim, or you don't have an appreciation of beautiful things, or that. And actually, I wanted to show the enormous amount of self-worth that the characters have at the heart of the book. Agnes especially. Agnes has a real superpower in the fact that perhaps if she's suffered something bad or there's some trauma happening at home, she never goes over the front door without looking like a queen. She always steps out very regally and, beautifully made up, but really looks like a movie star. I was thinking a lot about this very radiant woman against a very grey cityscape. And there's a pride in that, and there's a self-worth in that. And her son, Shuggie, and all of, her children have that as well. They are taught to sort of walk with very straight backs and to reject any feeling of shame that they should have around their poverty or around what they're going through. And really what I wanted to do with the book as well was, even if I was looking at something that was quite ugly or hard to look at, Inger, I wanted to look at the beauty within that situation, or to create it as beautifully as I could. Because I find life can often live cheek by jowl like that, where things that can be hard or violent often have a moment of tenderness or beauty within them, or humor. Even in like extreme sadness, it's a very human thing for us to want to cope with humor. And so for me, there was always beauty in the ugliness.
But it's interesting too, because as you see, as understandable as this thirst for beauty is, you can sense, I think about Agnes, that perhaps it would be more clever of her to tone it down, because it does elicit some reaction in her neighbors, in her circumstances, that it's looked upon as some kind of haughtiness, or that she thinks herself above the rest of them, isn't it?
Yeah, and actually she does. She is quite haughty, and she does think of herself as above the rest of them. And I was really thinking about the solidarity that comes in working class communities. There's an enormous amount of solidarity there, because people are going through the same thing at the same time. And also that's the joy of writing a working class novel, is there is a lot of people in it together. But I wanted to invert that, because sometimes the solidarity is united in excluding you. And when you seem to be rejecting or having airs and graces above your station, it's a very human reaction sometimes for everyone else wanting to pull you down to their level, or wanting to pick at that. And I noticed that from my own life, not just my childhood, but from everywhere around us. And so Agnes's self-worth and her pride actually become her Achilles heel as well as her strength. And she certainly infects her son Shuggie with that. And so he's seen by the other boys as being incredibly fussy and precocious and too sensitive, and he's ostracized really quickly. So it backfires and hurts them all.
You work in fashion yourself, and I was thinking when I was doing my research here that there are quite a number of prominent designers who in fact were born into poverty or in fact quite meager material circumstances. You have Cristobal Balenciaga, you have Coco Chanel. How do you think growing up in need shapes your approach to fashion and to luxury once you enter that world?
Yeah, fashion and luxury, I think as a
different
child,
things, of course, but no, still.
I think sometimes when you grow up with need or you grow up with some trauma, you're always inventing a different world for yourself. Sometimes it's through words and it's escapism, or it can be through the visual arts. And so for me, fashion was a way to sort of move towards the future I wanted to create. After having no control in my youth, to be a fashion designer gives you ultimate control. To be a writer also does too. And you can really create as beautiful a world as you want to and then step into it and invite other people into it. But I often find that the working class in the visual arts and in design have so much to say, because sometimes when situations are difficult or tough, then beauty like springs out of them. There's that cliche that, flowers come out of manure. And I think that can be often quite true. I think it's also true in literature. I just think literature is one of the last art forms to embrace working class voices.
In what way?
Well, I think we're such a huge part of the population, and I don't think we're represented in the United Kingdom equally in terms of the amount of books that are published. I think literature is still a very middle class thing, even in terms of reading and having the luxury. To be able to read a book is actually quite luxurious. To have the peace and the freedom from want or need can be quite a luxurious thing, to be able to focus on, give 12 hours to a book. And publishing is still that way. And so I was really thrilled to see Shuggie Bain represent a working class narrative.
One of the very early scenes which I underlined in the novel, it's right there at the beginning, is the one where Shuggie is tentatively searching for a course on hairdressing and comes across a group of youths, and they seem so confident and so updated and so on top of everything. And what happens is, in fact, that he just wordlessly turns around and goes home. So I thought, what is it like encountering that world when you perhaps feel that so many people are already way ahead of you and that they come with more knowledge and more experience than you've had a chance to obtain so far?
Yeah, Shuggie is absolutely intimidated by these other boys. And I don't really know so much about Norwegian society, Inger, but the British society has a very profound class system. It's very strong, it's very in place, and it gives us loud signals and sometimes indiscreet or discrete signals at the same time. And so Shuggie is feeling a deficit of his self-worth there when he sees all these other kids just looking like they belong, and he suddenly thinks, maybe this isn't for me, maybe I'm not worth this college course. And part of that is a comment on how I felt as a young boy. I'd always wanted to be a writer, but I went to school in a neighborhood where so many kids were falling behind in their education because they had so many needs not being met at home. There was such deprivation. I think, first of all, I'm the first person in my family to finish high school, but I think of the 250 kids that started high school in my year, only 12 finished. And so there was just such pressing things in the world. And so that meant that writing and academia and studying English weren't just accessible for me. And so Shuggie and his hairdressing course is really just a comment on that class thing.
I know, among other things, you worked as a knitwear designer. You're wearing a very lovely knit right now. And I understand that it was, in fact, your mother who taught you how to knit. So if I may ask you, what does knitting and knitwear mean to you? Because when I read that, I thought that seemed to be an interesting bridge between your childhood and your adult life and the way you have made a living as an adult.
Yeah, actually, I wasn't aware. I hadn't reflected on the fact that it was my mother that taught me to knit until much later in my life. But I was a lonely kid, and so to occupy me, she would give me just rectangles of knitting, and I made hundreds, thousands of them, and then she might make a quilt from them. It was never anything too complex, but I certainly went on to study textiles as a young man. And, textiles is a very proud Scottish industry. We make a lot of beautiful cloths, knitwear and tartan and lace. And so knitwear has always been sort of key to my existence. But I also tried to bring my textiles experience when I sat down to write. It's a bit of a cliche of a metaphor, but you focus really on every individual stitch as a writer, every little small micro action. And then you step back and you consider the tapestry that you're making, and then going back and seeing how things weave together. And if you pull on one, what will it do for another character later? And so I was aware of the discipline it took to make cloth, the very micro focused discipline, and trying to layer it up into something bigger like a book.
That's a really interesting perspective. I also wanted to talk about masculinity, which I think is a huge theme of your novel. But before we do that, maybe you have another part of your book that you'd like to read to us.
Yes, please. Thank you. This is actually a scene where the Bain family have been relocated to a mining town on the outside of Glasgow. And Leek, who's the middle son, is going scrapping for copper with his younger brother. He has noticed that Shuggie is struggling with his effeminacy, and he is trying to help Shuggie cope with that. Leek galloped down the last of the hills and waited for his brother at the bottom. The tide of slag moved like a landslide. Shuggie took large windmilling leaps, and on his second or third step, the slag suddenly solidified. His legs moved too fast, and with a sharp shriek, he pitched forward onto his front and slid the rest of the way on his face. He came to a rasping stop, and the slag rose silently around him, swallowing him like a grave. Leek reached down and with one hand lifted the boy clear of the coal by the strap on his backpack. A small black face with two white eyes blinked up at him in confusion and fear. Leek couldn't help but laugh. "What have I told you? You have to take it lighter on the way down, else you'll set the whole side of the fucking thing moving." "I know, but it starts sliding and I get a fright that I might get buried." Shuggie shook the slag from his black hair. "Mammy would burst you if I died." Leek set the boy down. "Do you have to be so annoying? Why can't you just be normal for once?" The boy turned from his brother. "I am normal." Leek thought he could see the pink rise on the back of Shuggie's neck. His shoulders shuddered with the start of tears. Leek spun his brother back around. "Don't turn away from me when I'm talking to you." He studied his face closely. It hadn't been rising tears. Leek knew the flush of shame and frustration well enough. "Are the kids at school still battering you?" "No." He twisted free from Leek's grip. "Sometimes." "Don't let it bother you. They see the one thing that's a bit more special than them and then they just pile on." Shuggie looked up at him. "I told Father Barry on them. I asked him to make it stop, but he only made me stay behind after the bell. He made me read about the persecuted saints." Leek tried not to smirk. "What a useless old bastard. That's just the way of the chapel. Stop complaining. It could be worse." He kicked off his tasseled loafer, and bending over, he emptied it of slag dust. "You know, when I was at school, they said there was a father that was diddling this one quiet boy. Can you imagine that?" He lifted his eyes and met Shuggie's face. "Has he ever touched you, Shuggie? Father Barry, that is." A cloud passed over Shuggie's face, dark enough to make Leek stop ridding himself of coal dust. "No," he said quietly. Then the words started tumbling out quicker than he could organize them. "But they said I did things to him. They said I did dirty things, but I promise, I don't even know what those things are." "I believe you. They're just bamming you up." Leek took his brother into his arms, and in a great crushing hug, he mashed the boy's face into his ribs. Thank you.
Thank you. In these paragraphs, there's a lot of talking about the way Shuggie walks, but obviously there are other things about him. His interest in beautiful things, in art, in dolls. These are things that are frowned upon where he grows up. And it's very early on established that the people around him thinks that he's not quite right. And I believe this is an experience you share with him. So I thought I'd ask you, what does it do to a kid, to a boy, to be constantly told that it's not quite okay to be the way that he is?
Yeah, you're right. Shuggie, very early on in the book, is sort of othered. And it's not a very complex argument. They just say, "Why are you feminine? Why are you like this?" And so he is isolated and persecuted for it. But then he spends a great deal of the book trying to, and later on in that scene I read, his brother teaches him how to walk like a man. He recites historical football scores that are entirely meaningless, but he thinks if he can take them in like a rosary, then he would become more like a normal boy. And as you say, Inger, what it does to a boy when that happens, when he can't see himself fitting in is it places a sense of self-hate within the child. And it also, it's reinforced to him that if he does something, he can change, he can fix it. It's not seen as something that's immovable, it's seen as something that he can resolve. And so Shuggie spends a lot of the book just trying to change in order to fit in, to have a sense of belonging. But it was a time of extreme narrowness, and not in Scotland, I think across a lot of the world, extreme narrowness in terms of masculinity. It was a time when heterosexual working class men weren't allowed to express their fears or their sadness or their tenderer feelings. They weren't really given an outlet for that. And so that had effects on all of masculinity. And it just meant that someone who's feminine and sensitive like Shuggie is isolated very quickly.
A bit of a related question, but you describe working class Glasgow and perhaps, a lot of other places as places where there were quite fixed perceptions of what it was like to be a real boy or a real man. So I thought one thing is Shuggie, but I thought about these other men. What do you think it does to boys to grow up with this rather narrow ideal of what it is to be a man? What does it do to them in the long term?
I think it's incredibly harmful, and it's harmful for them, first of all. We were asking also in this time men to do really dangerous jobs, to build ships, to go into a coalface, to work around melted ore. And yet we weren't allowing them to say, oh, I'm scared of that, or that terrifies me, or that's a dangerous thing. They just had to do it. And they couldn't lose face because that would be seen to be eroding their masculinity. And so what it resulted in often was very hard-working men who were also hard-loving, but also hard-fighting and hard-drinking, and could tip over into violence. And that was a dangerous place to be, because actually when men struggle, women and children suffer first and worst. And that's a lot of what the book is about. It's looking at this industrial landscape, but reframing it from a mother's point of view and from a young queer boy's point of view, because we often don't hear from those voices when we think about, an industrial backdrop. But it was a really harmful time for men, first of all, and then hopefully the book shows how that flows out.
Not long ago I read a short story of yours, one that's called Found Wanting, where you wrote about a young gay man getting in touch with other gay men through personal ads. And I understand that this too is something that's part of your own experience. So I wondered, when you come from this community and this narrow ideal of masculinity that we're talking about, how does one even get about finding a gay community when being gay and being effeminate is so taboo? Was it even possible to do that without putting yourself in danger, meeting strangers in secret? Just how did one do that?
Oh, it was an incredibly difficult time, and there was so much fumbling in the dark and taking these tiny little steps to find a community. But you're trying to find the community for the sense of yourself. And actually, the story I wrote from the New Yorker came from a conversation I had with a young gay friend who, of course, came of age in a time when Instagram connects you with people, when dating apps connect you with people. And it's not about necessarily sex or dating. It's just about finding people who like the same things that you do, whether that's music or fashion or books. And I just didn't have that. It wasn't that Glasgow wasn't a cosmopolitan city. It's that I was poor within Glasgow. So I couldn't access anything other than the housing scheme I was on. And so as a young man, I began to write these pen pal letters, these personal ads that were placed in the back pages of just a youth magazine. And what actually came from that was the most amazing blooming for me as a young man, because having spent 16 years feeling like the only person and being told by the people around me I was the only person, suddenly like all these other queer voices came out like stars in the firmament. And they just, all across the country, just people writing these pen pal letters back to me. And that's all it was. It was correspondence. But what it did to me as a man to know that I wasn't lonely was revolutionary.
Of course, in this novel, you also sometimes tell the story from the perspective of other men, sometimes Leek, but sometimes Shuggie's father, Big Shug, who is very conventionally male, if you wish, very, very heterosexual. So what was it like writing from his point of view, a point of view that is so far from Shuggie's? What did you do to try to see the world the way Big Shug does?
Yeah, you're right. Shug is really central to the book. And as a father, he is a man who is a very reluctant father, but also is a reluctant husband. And he has this sort of, I pictured him almost symbolically, as with Eugene, where there are these two men who are taxi drivers. And so they charge across the city almost like they're knights on white horses, or there's a dark knight in Shug, and then there's a very sort of heroic knight in Eugene towards the end of the book. But in order to write Shug, I again just had to understand what men were allowed to get away with at the time, and how they felt about women, and how they felt about their children, and and what society allowed them to do and didn't make them apologize for. And I think a lot of what happens in the book is, this was how things were. This is what people would accept, and no one challenges it. Whenever something traumatic happens to Agnes or to Shuggie, there's no place for that trauma to go. There's nowhere for them to turn to. And that was very much what it was like at the time. But Shug, even though he's quite a despicable character, I tried to have an empathy for him because I don't think he's got much joy in his life, and I don't think he's a happy man. And also he's got a very frail ego. And I was thinking about how sometimes when people have very frail egos, they use the person they love in order to feed that ego. And so the way he abandons Agnes, but also traps her, is totally a device to keep her sort of reflecting back to him so he feels better about himself.
Yeah, because I thought that attraction and destruction are sort of dual sides of his character, that what he is attracted to, he ends up destroying or wanting to destroy. Was that a duality you thought about?
Yeah, that was absolutely the duality of it. And also, I think there's no repercussions for Shug. He gets to move through the world. At the very beginning of the book, he walks out on his wife and his children, and he just decides he's leaving. And actually, he's angry at Agnes for not doing the same thing. And so destruction is very much part of his nature. But it's also, I think, part of his charm. I think the women who fall for him see that he's dangerous. And I talk a lot in the book about Agnes's perspective as a humble Catholic mother, seeing the sort of the shininess of Shug as a Protestant, because at the time we would think of Protestants as being a little bit more selfish, a little bit more glamorous, a little bit more dangerous, because they didn't follow the doctrines of the church as closely. And I think Agnes sees that destruction as something quite alluring. He's a dangerous man.
Well, let me just ask, I would like to continue a bit on this theme, but you're touching on something I find fascinating, and that is growing up in a world which is religiously almost sectarian. I mean, today when you read about the world you described 40 years ago, it almost is reminiscent of things you read from the Middle East and other parts of the world where religion and what religion you belong to is so defining for so many things and so many aspects of life. So I just thought I'd ask you, in what way did that conflict, that tension between Catholics and Protestants shape the world you grew up in?
Yeah, it had many different frequencies. And for many people, it's a thing that affects mostly just the west coast of Scotland and Glasgow in particular. It traces back to Irish immigration when Ireland was suffering and Glasgow and Scotland was booming in the Industrial Revolution. So it brought an enormous amount of Irish immigrants, my family being amongst them, to the west coast of Scotland, which was a predominantly Protestant nation. And when the Irish immigrants came, historically, they undercut the wages of the Protestant Union men. And so there was always an animosity there. But it starts to bloom and blossom in the 60s and 70s into almost what you would call recreational violence for young men or young gangs. Glasgow has the second largest Orange Pride March outside of Belfast. And you're probably very clued into the troubles that happen in Northern Ireland, which are very, very real. It never hit that scale in Glasgow. It was never about that sense of identity. But it did give young working class men ways to form into gangs, to cheer for football teams. But it meant that sectarian violence or religious bigotry could be something that happened at the dinner table. Within my own family, my Protestant father would say something lousy to my Catholic mother. My mother's parents didn't go to her wedding when she married a Protestant. And so there were small ways it would show up like that, up until it would then become sort of a way you would become violent as a young teenage boy sometimes.
To return a little bit to those men in Agnes's life, because as you mentioned, there is another man, another knight, the white knight, the more benign father figure perhaps in Shuggie's life, the well-meaning taxi driver Eugene, who's in a relationship with Agnes during a time in her life where she's actually sober. And yet for all his good intentions, he ends up ruining things and tripping her up so that she falls back into her addiction. Why does this happen? And what does it say about the way addiction was being regarded, that he can come in there and want to fix things and just end up doing the opposite.
Yeah, I think Eugene, who becomes a big love for Agnes, and we pin a lot of hope on Eugene, is a very good man. I believe him to be a good character and a good man, but he suffers with a warped hero complex. He believes that if he works hard enough and is strong enough, and because he's handsome and he's upstanding, then he can take this woman's life and make all of her problems evaporate. And so he spends a fair part of the book saying to Agnes, you know, I know you had a drink problem, but I don't believe you're an alcoholic. And now that I'm in your life, you can have a drink and you can just enjoy yourself because, hey, you have me. And I wanted to comment on how men just felt an oversized power in that way, where they felt, first of all, it's quite sort of influenced by Thomas Hardy and Tess of the D'Urbervilles, where we see sort of Tess be influenced by all the men and her worthiness be sort of judged by the men around her. And Eugene suffers from that. You know, Eugene is really thinks in that way as well. And we think of him as a white knight. He really charges in and he's going to save Agnes and scoop her up and make everything great for Shuggie and Leek. And of course, that's the plot twist.
So those are perhaps the most important men, Leek, Big Shug, Eugene, in addition to Shuggie. But I do feel that perhaps you have a special interest in the women of this community, this community of working class women, perhaps a little bit more, I don't know, fascination for them rather than the men they're married to. So I'd like to ask you, do you think there's something about the history of working class British women that has been under-communicated? And what about that, their lives, was it that you wanted your readers to know more about?
It's absolutely been under-communicated, and I think it's not been celebrated enough. You know, Shuggie stands in a long line of literary tradition. There are many British writers writing about the industrial landscape, but it's not always from, that's a generalization, but it's often from a male's point of view, or centres a man at the heart of it. I think about Alistair Gray and Alan Stillitoe. I think about Irvine Welsh, if you like. But I'd always known, actually, Glasgow, because I'm the son of a single mother, to be a woman's world. And we were almost a subculture within it and a sub-network. And, you know, it was not only just my mother, but her friends and the community she made. And so I wanted to really put that at the fore of this big social upheaval under the Thatcher years, and just to show how women were also there, but also how queer voices were there. But I also think women are far more interesting characters. I think they face much more challenges. I think they face them with more sort of ingenuity and resolve, and their lives were just much more complex. And so I was really lucky to be a kid who grew up in a world of women and saw and heard things that I probably shouldn't have seen and heard, but it's definitely inspired me, and I wanted to just celebrate it.
As you say, it is in a way a tribute to working class women and what they have had to endure. But it's really not entirely a benign world, this world of women. There's not always companionship between them. And very often in your novel, there's competition and there's cruelty as well. So I thought I'd ask you, what is at the root of this competitiveness, this suspicion between these women who are in similar circumstances? Because they're really not always nice to each other.
No, they're not. And actually, I found that to be true. And I was thinking about the patriarchy and how it can infect so many people. And we often think of men doing all the damage within a patriarchy, but especially in a devout religious communities, sometimes it can really infect the women, and the women can do a lot of damage to other women in that way too. I've always known that there can be jealousy and envy and competition and spite between women. I saw it with my own eyes. And Agnes is a threat to a lot of these other female characters in the book. You know, the very first question they ask her is, who is your man? Which one of these is your men? And Agnes, as a single mother, doesn't have a husband behind her. And so for this very Catholic, traditional community, this very beautiful woman who doesn't have a man at home is really threatening to a lot of these women. And then she deigns to have this feeling of self-worth and this beauty and this glamour, and the rest of them are sort of also beautiful women but are struggling to get by, and they make her feel very uneasy.
Does poverty hit women and children differently from men? And if so,
yes.
In what way?
This was a time, and actually Deborah Orr writes a really incredible memoir called Motherwell. Deborah was the editor of the Guardian newspaper in the UK, and would have been a contemporary to Agnes Bain if Agnes Bain was a real person. But she writes very much about the limited social possibilities that were afforded to her, how growing up, similar to Agnes, only 0.003% of university students, higher education students, came from the labour class. And then she, if you look at how many of those would be women, it would almost be so minuscule. And so I think poverty, first of all, affects the character of Agnes and the women around her, because they were told to put their faith in a social contract. Get married young, raise a decent family, build your house, and everything will be fine. Put your trust in your husband and your man to bring in a wage. And when you take that community and you raise unemployment to 26%, everything collapses, because you can know why did you marry this man? What is happening here? Everything is affected, but it happens to the women. And yet then they turn around and the thing they were told to trust in evaporates. And so in hindsight, it was a really important moment for equalizing the sexes and for shaking up those traditional relationships. But at the time, to live through it, it was hellish for mothers like my own and the women around them.
Now, at the present time, you are a worldly man. You have experience as a fashion designer, as an executive. You're living in New York. But for this novel, you had to go back to a world and write about people whose perspectives and whose references were a lot more limited than what yours are today. So what are the challenges about writing about very poor people who move in a very small world? And how do you accomplish that without writing down to them, so to speak, if you understand what I'm asking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was difficult. I think because I wrote the book as a personal project and I didn't know if it would be published, I never really had an idea of a readership in mind. And so I felt that everything I was writing was either in support or standing beside the characters. I wasn't trying to explain them to a broader world. I was trying to explain them to themselves. And so that allowed me to be incredibly brave with sorry, that sounds self-congratulating. That gave me a sense that I could be brave with what I was trying to do with language, first of all, but also with how I was showing things. And then the other challenge with the book was, how in 2018 did I write about society in 1980s without infecting it with our standards or our morals or our understanding of the 2018? There are a lot of things in the book that happen wouldn't fly today, or wouldn't stand up today, and I'm grateful for that. But I also had to go back and tell it from the truth of the 1980s and not try to enforce my own morals on it from here. And so that was hard. I had to, I wrote a lot, I unpicked a lot, I rewrote it again. I had to keep asking myself those questions.
What were those challenges? Do you have a specific example in mind?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to show misogyny as a male writer in 2018. It's difficult to show homophobia. It's difficult to really, sometimes in the book, the characters say very homophobic things to the people they love the most. And if I was writing it now and setting it now, people just wouldn't do that or most people wouldn't do that. And yet I couldn't pull my punches. I had to write it from the truth of what Agnes went through and what Shuggie went through. And there was lots of just small word choices even, or how Shug treats his wife or what he thinks about his son that passed through the lenses of today would be entirely different. But another thing that I'm constantly asking her is, but the world is so much better and we're in a different place. And I think that's 1,000% true. But I also do think people are constantly left behind. And I think we don't talk enough about those people. And so there's still Shuggies out in the world. I'm told every day from Detroit to Delhi to Naples that, families are still going through what Agnes and Shuggie lived through.
You were mentioning earlier that this is, of course, also a novel about Margaret Thatcher's Britain. And there have been several reckonings with Thatcher's Britain in the arts over the years. Recently, there was Gillian Anderson's award-winning turn in The Crown. And this era has also been a theme of several novels, for instance, the novels of Alan Hollinghurst. So we've been looking at the Thatcher years for so many angles. But what was life during the Thatcher years like for you when you were growing up? What about the Thatcher years was it that you wanted to bring across?
Yeah, I think there's been an enormous attempt to rehabilitate Margaret Thatcher as a figure through history. And I think you can't do that without actually looking at what her policies did to the people on the ground, the people she was responsible for. But it was discovered in the early 2000s that the Thatcher government knew how high the unemployment was across the nation, knew how many families were struggling, and decided that she was just going to essentially write them off. She was going to mark Glasgow in particular, which is an enormous city, as a place of decline. And they weren't going to try and stem that decline or bring jobs there. They were just going to manage it down the hill. And so what that really tells you is the government just didn't care. They didn't see us. They realized quite quickly that actually we weren't voting for them, or we weren't going to give them any power. And therefore, when we wouldn't give them power, they weren't going to give us any resources. And so for my entire youth, I just felt very uncared for by the people who were in power. And when you see in an Alan Hollinghurst novel, or you see on The Crown, you know, London society booming and enjoying the Thatcher years, it absolutely wasn't like that for working class societies. And that wasn't just Glasgow, that's Birmingham and Newcastle and Manchester. And so I think, again, to come back to our conversation about why working class voices in literature matter, is because we're capturing the fullness of history, not just told from the middle class perspective or people who might have benefited under the Thatcher government.
Although you weren't always particularly well treated when you were growing up, I think you described the city of Glasgow with a lot of warmth in your novel, and it's obviously a place you're still very fond of. What is it about Glasgow and about Glaswegians that you cherish the most, and that influenced the way you portray them?
I've actually never met people with more compassion than Glaswegians, and the city itself has just an overflowing humanity. It's, you know, it can sometimes be an incredibly warm and funny city. It can sometimes be quite dark and violent, but it lives its life to the edges and very full. It really is all these opposing feelings and doesn't ever apologize for them. And I really like that. It's also incredibly inspiring as a city, because I think for such a proud city to have gone through such a difficult time and then be on the ascension again just means that we've lived very rich lives and very unfiltered lives. And so I find inspiration in Glasgow. But even writing Shuggie from New York and looking back on the city, there was a sense of longing for me for the city and a little bit of homesickness, because I've never felt more at home than I have in my hometown, which is a funny thing to say, because as a young man, I never felt at home there at all. I was never allowed to feel like I belonged. And so it's strange that now as an adult, I'm trying to find my way home.
Does this Glasgow still exist, the Glasgow of your childhood? Or is it all changed during those 40 years?
It's both. So Glasgow will always remain the creative, compassionate place that it is. And it's certainly booming and had a huge restoration and rehabilitation, but there are still kids being left behind. There's still an enormous amount of people living in poverty, but not just in Glasgow, all throughout the United Kingdom. I think we have a third of kids living in poverty in the UK, and for the fifth richest economy in the world, that's a staggering number. You will have seen the things in the press about school dinners, about exam marks, about charities feeding children in London. And that's, you know, so I feel like I want to say everything's so much better, but I feel like we also have to remember people who feel left behind by progress.
You obviously bolted out of this world as well, and you talked about the important role that education has played in your life. So could you tell us a little bit about the Scottish school system and the teachers you encountered and what those encounters meant for your life? And to what degree was that necessary to see yourself perhaps in a different light from what you already did?
Yeah, teachers saved my life. At 16, when my mother died, I was more or less alone in the world, and I was living by myself, and I was trying to finish my high school education. And it was really teachers that encouraged me and saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, both my English masters and my art masters. Education is the thing that really transformed everything for me. Because even my brother and my uncles who were working hard jobs still felt like they were struggling a lot. And And so I was really fortunate to be a kid that grew up in quite a socialist country that gave him access to a really world-class university education. And I tried to make the most of that, learning about textiles and textile design. And so education for me was really transformative. It was very important to me. And I encourage education for anyone who has access to it in that way. But it was always educators that saw a bigger future for me than I saw for myself.
And you mentioned Thomas Hardy a couple of times during this conversation. What authors were the most important to you and inspiring to you when you started being a serious reader and later a writer? I suspect Hardy is one of them, but why is that?
Hardy is certainly one of them. And actually, funnily enough, when I really have agency over my own reading and I try to discover myself, is when I almost have to turn around and look at facets of myself that I have to uncover. And so that led me really into working class literature and also queer literature. And so in terms of working class literature, I'm an enormous fan of Alan Warner, who wrote Morven Caller. Also, as we spoke about, James Kelman, who won the Booker in the mid-90s. And one of my favorite books ever is A Kestrel for a Knave by Barry Hines, which I think was made into a Ken Loach movie called Kess. And so it was just great to see these urgent, proud working class lives on the page and represented in literature. But then also to discover my queerness, because this is something else you don't get sort of access to as a young man. And that's when James Baldwin comes into my life, Jeanette Winterston, Alan Hollinghurst, E.M. Forrester, all of these people who have had a huge influence on me. And so at first, for my youth, I used literature as a means of self-discovery, but also to register my passage on the earth and to say I'm also here.
I think you've also mentioned Tennessee Williams, which I found fascinating because Williams is also really good at describing mothers and sons and that very complex bond. So I don't know, in what way has Tennessee Williams mattered to you?
He's an enormous influence, and actually most playwrights are, but Tennessee Williams for me has a lot of influence on Shuggie Bain in a way, because Agnes is also quite a camp, oversized woman who's really bursting with emotions and, very, very big swings in her emotion. And so I think a lot about Amanda Wingfield in The Glass Menagerie, who's this very wounded mother and hoping for better for her kids. And then, of course, there's Blanche Dubois, who is looking for a good time and, she has all this trauma and she's crumbling. And I felt a deep empathy for Tennessee Williams when I discovered him at 16, because he was writing these women who were complicated and hurt and just really luminous. And so there's a little bit of him, I think, influencing Shuggie Bain.
I know Shuggie Bain was rejected actually quite a number of times before finally being published. And I would believe that there are now a good amount of editors out there who are having certain regrets seeing what happened to that novel afterwards. But as for you, how did you stay confident during those years? When you are rejected, what do you tell yourself to keep going?
You just have to keep going. I believe so. It wasn't that I necessarily believed in the book as a whole, but I felt so deeply for the characters at the heart of it. And so I was proud to have created them. But Shuggie, when it was sent out for submission, was rejected really soundly and very quickly across the board. And actually, this is where I have to say, thank you so much to Norwegian readers, because actually Norway was one of the very first countries that said, yes, we want to publish this book, when it was still a rough manuscript, long before anyone else had ever read it. And so I think that says a lot for Norwegian curiosity and for belief in literature. So thank you for that. But you just have to keep going. You have to believe in your work. And actually, throughout all the rejection, I didn't alter anything about the book. Most of the rejection was about publishers didn't know how to connect readers with this family living in Glasgow. How did they even explain this book to the world? And I think most publishers thought the book came from so outside the zeitgeist. Are we really talking about this mother and son? Is this what's going on in the world at the moment? And of course, what publishing Shuggie has surprised even me with is really at the center of the zeitgeist, especially during the pandemic, because there's so many people who in the UK especially have felt unseen.
When I read your novel, I think that it is rather sensuous. It's very visual, very perceptive about material things, aesthetic things. And I'm not surprised that you've also worked as a designer, but I thought I'd ask you, in what way do you think your experience as a designer has influenced the way you write and what you notice and what you want to keep in your novel when you're trying to describe things and give your readers a sense of the way things are?
Yeah. Design, or good design for me, is really all about paying very close attention to details, and then knowing how you move those details around can create something entirely different. And so you almost have to really revere that attention as a designer. And when I was creating Shuggie Bain, when I was writing it, I knew that I wanted to create an immersive world, because I'd always felt slightly misunderstood in the world, Inger, where, especially as an American immigrant, no one really knew what I came from, or what I was like as a kid, or what that world would be like. And so, although I never knew the book would be published, I wanted to create this manifesto, almost an operator's manual that explains the world and explains me, and really creates this immersive experience for anyone who would read it as I could. And actually, the very first person to read it was my husband, and the only person to read it for 10 years was my husband. And even though we've been together for 24 years, I think there's a really unique power to literature to allow someone to put their feet in your shoes and really experience the world. And so it was a revelation even for him, but most of that came from my visual background, my ability to pay attention to details, and then also to tell stories through the visual.
We are fast approaching the end of our allotted time. I think we're time for one more question. In what way has writing this novel changed the way you look at your own childhood and background? What do you think of your early years now that you perhaps did not think when you started out?
That's a great question. I don't know that I've fully reflected on that yet. It's been such a busy year. I was grateful for the ability to be able to write the book. I was grateful to, especially as a man, I think, because I think still I carry a lot of feelings about growing up on the west coast of Scotland, where we weren't meant to share how we felt or think of ourselves as exceptional, either exceptionally fantastic or exceptionally hard done to. We were just meant to keep it inside and get on. And so I'm incredibly grateful that I have art as a way to express myself, and also to explain myself to myself, and really to parse it out. Writing Shuggie was incredibly cathartic for me. It was a good opportunity for me to release things, but it was also an opportunity for me to understand better and deeper things that I hadn't ever had a chance to stop and pause and think about. So the writing the book was really, something I had to do.
I think that's a lovely way to end our talk. I'm so sorry we couldn't do it in person. Hopefully you'll come here someday and meet all your dedicated readers here. They are quite numerous. But for now, I think I'll just say thank you so much for sharing this hour with your readers in Bergen and Norway, and have a lovely evening in New York.
Thank you, Inger, and thank you to all the amazing Norwegian readers. I'm so grateful for you. Thank you.